He wasn't supposed to be remembered. Not like this. Not at the very edge of a quiet room where the clock ticked louder than any heartbeat and the world had already moved on without him. And yet there he stood, a German shepherd with fading strength and steady eyes, waiting for something no one believed would come. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain-soaked pavement drifting in through a cracked window, the kind of scent that lingers when a storm has passed but the sky hasn't quite forgiven the earth. A stainless steel tray rested beside the examination table, untouched but ready, its contents arranged with the quiet finality of routine. The veterinarian moved gently, not rushed, not cold, just practiced, as if this moment had happened too many times to carry weight anymore. And maybe that was the saddest part. The dog didn't struggle. He didn't whine. He didn't even look afraid. He simply faced the door, ears twitching at every distant sound, as though somewhere deep in memory there was still a promise echoing, something unfinished, something that hadn't let go. Outside, tires hissed softly on wet asphalt, and a faint rumble of thunder rolled far off like a memory that refused to fade. The fluorescent lights above hummed low, steady, indifferent. A clipboard lay at the foot of the table with a name crossed out once, rewritten, then circled, as if even the ink wasn't certain what to do with him. Rex. Age, 7. Status, unadoptable. The word sat heavier than it should have, heavier than any label had a right to be. But labels don't ask questions, they just close doors. 30 seconds. Someone murmured quietly, not unkindly, just acknowledging the time left. And time, like everything else in that room, moved forward whether anyone was ready or not. Rex shifted his weight slightly, claws tapping once against the tile floor, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been, like a signal sent into silence with no one left to receive it. But then, something changed, not in the room, not in the light, but in the air itself, subtle as a breath drawn too slowly, as a door opening somewhere down the hall. Footsteps. Uneven. Measured. A soft tap followed by a pause. Then another, like someone learning the shape of the ground with patience instead of sight. The door at the far end of the hallway creaked open, and with it came the faint scent of worn leather, clean cotton, and something older, something like dust and sunlight baked into memory. The man who entered didn't look toward the table. He couldn't. His eyes, pale and unfocused, rested somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the room, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. A white cane touched the floor before each step, guiding him forward with quiet certainty. Ethan Walker, 38, former U.S. Marine. The kind of man who carried silence like a second skin, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had already said too much once, in another life, under a different sky. He wasn't here for the dog. Not yet. Not knowingly. He had come for a routine check, a simple appointment, something ordinary in a life that had lost most of its edges. But ordinary has a way of breaking when it brushes against something unfinished. Rex's ears lifted. Just slightly. His body stilled, every muscle tightening not in fear, but in recognition that hadn't fully formed yet. The vet noticed, hesitated, then glanced at the clock again, as if unsure whether to continue or wait for something she couldn't explain. Ethan took another step, then another, the tap of his cane marking each second like a metronome for a moment no one had planned. He paused near the doorway, tilting his head just enough to listen, and in that pause, the room held its breath. Rex didn't move closer. He didn't bark. He simply stood, eyes fixed, as if holding on to a thread that stretched across years, across distance, across everything that had been lost. And somewhere in that fragile silence, before memory had a name, before recognition found its shape, something unseen began to return. The memory does not arrive all at once. It never does. It seeps in like cold air under a door, slow and unnoticed until the room begins to change. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, something older than the moment starts to rise. Years earlier, the air had been dry, stretched thin over miles of sand and heat that shimmered under a relentless sun. The kind of place where silence was never truly silent because it carried weight, expectation, the sense that something unseen was always just beyond reach. Ethan Walker had stood there then with steady eyes and a firm voice, boots planted in dust that remembered every step, every command, every promise made under a sky too wide to hold them all. He had not been blind back then. He had seen everything. The horizon, the shifting light, the way the wind carved patterns into the earth like fingerprints left by time itself. And beside him, always just half a step to the left, was Rex, younger, stronger, his coat catching the sunlight in shades of sable and shadow, his ears alert to every movement that did not belong. They had moved as one, not because they were trained to, but because something deeper had taken root between them, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Orders were given in short, precise words, never wasted, never repeated, each one carrying trust like a thread pulled tight between two lives. Stay, wait, go. The language of survival, stripped down to its bones, but filled with something else beneath it, something closer to faith than command. There had been a morning, one that did not stand out at first, when the light came softer, filtered through a thin veil of dust that turned everything gold at the edges, when Ethan had paused longer than usual, scanning a path that looked no different from any other, but felt wrong in a way he could not explain. Rex had stopped before he did. That was always how it happened. A shift in posture. A stillness that carried meaning. The kind of stillness that said something mattered. Ethan had trusted it without question. He always did. He had lifted a hand, just slightly, and spoken a single word into the quiet, the same word that had shaped countless moments before it, the same word that carried both caution and care. Stay? Rex had obeyed instantly, muscles coiled but unmoving, eyes fixed ahead, holding his place not because he was forced to, but because he understood what it meant to hold the line when it mattered most. Seconds passed, then more, stretching longer than they should have, until the air itself seemed to lean in, waiting for something to reveal itself. It never came, not in a way that could be seen, not in a way that could be explained later in reports or written down in clean, measured lines. But Ethan had felt it, that subtle shift, that almost invisible warning that had saved more than one life in ways no one ever fully counted. He had exhaled slowly, lowering his hand, and Rex had moved again, stepping forward with the same quiet confidence, the same trust that had never faltered. That was how it had always been between them. Not dramatic, not loud, just a series of small, exact moments where one life leaned into another and found something solid to stand on. Back in the present, that same thread trembled, stretched across years that had taken too much and left too little behind, and Rex stood in that sterile room with the echo of that word still buried somewhere deep inside him, waiting not for a command, but for the voice that had once made the world make sense. Ethan shifted his weight near the doorway, his hand tightening slightly around the handle of his cane as if he could feel something pulling at him, something familiar without form, like a memory just out of reach. The veterinarian watched him carefully now, no longer focused on the clock, no longer certain that time was the only thing that mattered. Rex took one slow step forward, then stopped again, holding himself in that same practiced stillness, as if the past had not ended, as if it had only been waiting for the right moment to return. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it held years inside it, years of silence, of separation, of nights where names were spoken into darkness with no answer, and mornings that came anyway. And still, in that fragile space, something refused to break. Something refused to be forgotten. Time does not break cleanly. It frays, it leaves edges behind. And somewhere along those edges was the moment everything slipped out of place, the moment when names stopped reaching ears and commands stopped finding their way home. After that last mission, there had been paperwork, always paperwork, neat lines and official language trying to contain things that were never meant to be contained. And in those lines, something went wrong, something small enough to be overlooked, but heavy enough to change everything. Rex was reassigned on paper before he ever understood he had been left behind, labeled for evaluation, then flagged for behavior that no one fully understood. Words like unstable, unpredictable, too reactive written by hands that had never stood beside him in the heat, that had never felt the quiet precision of his restraint. He had not become different, not really, but without Ethan, the world around him had lost its shape, and when a dog trained to listen loses the voice he trusts, silence becomes something else entirely. Days turned into weeks inside a training facility that smelled of concrete and disinfectant, where commands came from strangers and meant less each time they were spoken, where every hesitation was marked, recorded, misunderstood. Rex obeyed when he could, froze when he could not. And in those moments of stillness, the same stillness that once saved lives, they saw defiance instead of discipline. Meanwhile, Ethan woke into darkness that did not lift with morning, a darkness that followed him into every room, every step, every memory that now had to be felt instead of seen. The doctors spoke gently, their voices careful, measured, filled with words meant to soften reality. But none of them knew how to replace what had been lost, not just sight, but the one presence that had anchored him through everything. Rex had not been just a partner. He had been direction, distance, warning, reassurance, a second set of senses that did not fail when the world became uncertain. And then, suddenly, he was gone, not with a goodbye, not with a hand on his head or a final command, just gone into a system that moved faster than grief could follow. Ethan asked about him at first, quietly, then more insistently, but answers came back incomplete, delayed, or not at all, lost in transfers and reports and names that no longer matched the dog he knew. Over time, the questions grew softer, not because they mattered less, but because repeating them began to feel like reaching into empty space. Nights became the hardest. That was when memory sharpened, when the absence of a familiar weight at his side became something almost physical, something that pressed against him until sleep finally took him under. He would say the name sometimes without realizing it. Rex, spoken into a room that offered no reply, followed by commands that slipped out of habit, stay, wait, words that no longer had a place to land. Back in the present, the room held that same quiet tension, that same unfinished space where something should have been, but was not. The veterinarian lowered her hands slightly, uncertain now, watching the way the dog held himself, the way the man stood just inside the doorway, as if caught between leaving and staying. Ethan turned his head a fraction, listening, not to anything obvious, not to voices or movement, but to something subtler, something that brushed against instinct the way wind brushes against skin, unseen but undeniable. He took a slow step forward, then another, his cane tapping lightly against the tile, each sound measured, deliberate, but beneath it there was a hesitation, a question he did not yet have words for. Rex mirrored that movement with a single shift of weight, then stillness again, holding the distance exactly as he had been trained, exactly as he had always done when waiting for permission to close the space between himself and the one he served. Years had passed, but discipline does not forget. It waits, it holds its place even when everything else falls away. The clock on the wall continued its steady count, indifferent to the change unfolding beneath it, marking seconds that no longer felt the same as they had moments before. 30 seconds had stretched into something longer, something deeper, something that could not be measured by time alone. And in that fragile, suspended moment, two lives that had once moved as one stood separated by only a few steps, and everything that had come between them, waiting, not for certainty, but for a single thread strong enough to pull them back. There are moments when the world does not shift with noise or force, but with something quieter, something so small it almost escapes notice, like a breath held too long finally released. And in that room, under the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the soft ticking of a clock that no longer seemed to matter, that moment began to take shape. Ethan stopped moving, not because he had reached his destination, but because something inside him had reached out first, something older than thought, older than reason, something built in places that do not rely on sight. His hand tightened slightly around the cane, then loosened, as if even that familiar support had become secondary to whatever was pulling at him now. The air felt different. Not warmer, not colder, just fuller, as if. It carried a presence he could not name, but somehow recognized. Rex did not move either. He stood anchored in that exact point on the floor, muscles steady, breath slow, holding himself with the same discipline that had once defined him, the same discipline that had been misunderstood, misread, and nearly erased. His ears remained forward, his body aligned, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in readiness, the kind that waits for permission, the kind that does not act without meaning. The veterinarian glanced between them, her hand hovering just inches above the tray, uncertainty settling into her posture like a question she could not answer. She had seen hesitation before, seen animals react to strangers, to sounds, to smells, but this was different. This was not reaction. This was recognition waiting for its final piece. Ethan tilted his head slightly, listening, not for footsteps or voices, but for something beneath it all, something that brushed against memory like a faint echo trying to become whole again. His breathing slowed. The room narrowed, not physically, but in the way focus gathers around a single point when everything else begins to fall away. He took one more step, careful, deliberate, his boot landing softly against the tile, and then he stopped again, closer now, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance, but like something fragile, something that could break if rushed. Rex's tail gave the slightest movement, not a wag, not yet, just a shift, like a signal held back, waiting for confirmation. His chest rose, then fell, steady, controlled, every instinct inside him balancing between restraint and the pull of something deeply familiar. Time stretched again, thinner now, quieter, as if even the clock had softened its presence out of respect for what was unfolding. Ethan's lips parted slightly, not with intention at first, but with instinct, the kind that surfaces when the body remembers before the mind can catch up. There was no plan in it, no conscious decision, just a fragment of who he had been rising to meet, who he still was. The word formed slowly, shaped by years that had not erased it, by a bond that had not been broken, only buried beneath silence and distance and loss. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, carrying the weight of something that had once meant everything. Stay? It was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried across the space between them with the same quiet authority it had always held, the same certainty that did not demand obedience but expected it because it had been earned. Rex froze. Completely. Every muscle locked into place. Every movement halted not in confusion, but in perfect understanding. His ears snapped forward, sharper now, his eyes widening just slightly as something long buried surged to the surface. The room changed in that instant, not visibly, but in the way energy shifts when truth reveals itself. The veterinarian inhaled softly, her hand lowering without thought, the tray forgotten, the clock irrelevant. Rex did not move forward. He did not break position. He held the command exactly as he had been trained, exactly as he had done countless times before, honoring the word before anything else, before instinct, before emotion, before the overwhelming pull to close the distance. That was who he was. That was what had never left him. Ethan stood still, his own breath catching slightly, as if he felt the response without seeing it, as if the space around him had answered in a language he had not forgotten how to hear. Seconds passed, but they no longer felt like seconds. They felt like something else, something suspended, something sacred in its quiet precision. And in that stillness, in that perfect, unwavering obedience, the past did not feel distant anymore. It felt present, alive, waiting for the next word to bring it fully home. The word did not fade when it was spoken. It lingered, settled into the space like something that had been waiting years to be heard again, and Rex held it with absolute precision, as if the command had never been interrupted, as if time itself had simply paused and now resumed exactly where it left off. His body remained still, every line of him aligned with discipline, but beneath that stillness something deeper had awakened, something that moved not in muscle but in memory, rising through him with quiet force. His breathing changed first, just slightly, a subtle shift that carried recognition before action, and his eyes, steady and focused, softened in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with knowing. Ethan felt it before he understood it, the way the air seemed to respond, the way silence no longer felt empty but full, as if something had stepped back into place without asking permission. His fingers loosened around the cane completely now, the object slipping into the background of his awareness, replaced by something far more certain, far more familiar. He did not move right away. He did not rush forward. Because somewhere deep inside him, beyond the loss, beyond the years of absence, he remembered the rhythm, the way trust was built not in sudden motion but in measured steps, in respect for what stood between two beings who once moved as one. Rex waited, not because he had to, but because he chose to honor the word fully, completely, the way he always had. The veterinarian lowered her hands entirely now, the tray forgotten at her side, her eyes fixed on the dog with a kind of stillness that came from witnessing something she could not explain, something that did not belong to routine or procedure or anything she had been trained to expect. The clock ticked again, but softer now, less certain of its place in the room. Ethan drew a slow breath, steadying himself, not out of fear, but out of recognition that something fragile was unfolding, something that could not be forced. His voice, when it came again, was quieter, almost a whisper, but no less certain. Easy. It was not a command in the same way, not sharp, not precise, but it carried the same foundation, the same trust woven through it. Rex responded, not by breaking position abruptly, but by releasing it with control, the way he had been taught, the way he had always done when given permission. His body softened first, tension easing in small increments. Then he took a single step forward, deliberate, careful, as if approaching something sacred. Another step followed, slower still, his head lowering just slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, in the quiet language that had always existed between them. The distance closed inch by inch, each movement measured, each breath aligned with something older than either of them could name. Ethan lowered himself to one knee without thinking, guided not by sight but by certainty, his free hand extending forward into the space where he felt that presence most strongly, fingers open, steady, waiting. He did not call out a name. Not yet. Because names belong to the surface, and what stood between them now was deeper than that, rooted in something that had never needed words to exist. Rex stopped just short of him, close enough that the warmth of his breath reached Ethan's hand, close enough that the faint scent of dust and fur and something unmistakably familiar settled into the air. He paused there, holding himself in that final moment of restraint, as if confirming what his instincts had already accepted, as if honoring the last boundary before everything changed. Then, slowly, with a care that spoke of years of training and something far more personal beneath it, he stepped forward and lowered his head into Ethan's outstretched hand. The contact was gentle, intentional, complete. Ethan's fingers closed softly into the fur at the top of Rex's head, and in that instant, something inside him gave way, not breaking, but opening, like a door that had been shut for too long finally allowing light to pass through. His breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition so deep it bypassed thought entirely. Rex remained still under his touch, not moving away, not shifting, simply present, as if anchoring Ethan to something solid again, something real. The room seemed to exhale around them, the tension dissolving without announcement, replaced by a quiet that felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but steady, grounded. The veterinarian took a step back without realizing it, her role in the moment no longer defined by action, but by witnessing. Ethan's hand trembled slightly against Rex's fur, then steadied, his thumb brushing along a familiar ridge, tracing a path that memory knew even if his eyes could not confirm it. And then, finally, the name surfaced, not forced, not questioned, but spoken with the quiet certainty of something that had never truly been lost. Rex. The name did not echo, it settled, soft and certain, like something returning to where it had always belonged, and Rex did not move away from it, did not question it, because he had never needed to learn that name twice. His body leaned forward just slightly into Ethan's hand, not enough to break the discipline that still lived in him, but enough to acknowledge what had just been restored, something deeper than recognition, something closer to home. Ethan's fingers tightened gently in the thick fur, tracing familiar lines, mapping a face he could no longer see but somehow knew. With absolute clarity, as if memory had become its own kind of vision. His breath trembled once, then steadied, the weight of years pressing and lifting at the same time, a quiet release that did not need sound to be understood. Rex remained still, but his tail moved now, slow and low, a controlled motion that carried more meaning than any sudden excitement ever could, because this was not surprise, this was confirmation, this was the return of something that had never fully left. The veterinarian stood a few feet away, her hands now resting at her sides, her eyes moving between them with a kind of disbelief that softened into something else, something quieter, something that did not try to explain what she was witnessing. The tray behind her remained untouched, the tools no longer part of the moment, no longer relevant in the presence of something that had shifted the outcome without a single instruction from her. Ethan's other hand moved slowly, cautiously, finding the side of Rex's neck, then the base of his ear, his touch careful but certain, each movement guided by memory rather than sight, each gesture confirming what his heart had already accepted. "You stayed," he murmured, the words barely more than breath, but carrying a weight that filled the room. Rex responded not with sound, but with stillness, the kind of stillness that holds meaning, the kind that says yes without needing to speak. He lowered himself slightly, just enough that his head rested more fully into Ethan's hand, offering not submission, but trust, the same trust that had once guided them through places where uncertainty lived in every step. The clock continued its quiet rhythm on the wall, but it no longer marked anything that mattered, because time had already given way to something else, something outside of minutes and seconds, something measured instead in moments that change everything without warning. Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing in a way they had not in years, as if something heavy had finally found its place again. "I thought I lost you," he said softly, not as a question, not even as a statement, but as something that had lived inside him for too long without release. Rex shifted closer by a fraction, closing the last space between them, his body aligning with Ethan's in that familiar way, the way that had once been second nature, the way that now returned without hesitation. The veterinarian glanced down at the clipboard still resting near the table, the word written there suddenly feeling wrong, out of place, as if it belonged to a different story entirely, one that no longer applied. She stepped forward slowly, not to interrupt, but to understand, her voice quiet when it finally came. "He responded to you," she said, more to herself than to Ethan, as if saying it out loud might make it clearer. Ethan did not turn toward her. He did not need to. He always did. He replied simply, his hand never leaving Rex's head, his connection to the dog unbroken now, solid, real. Rex's breathing matched his, slow and steady, the rhythm sinking in a way that felt instinctive, natural, as if they had never been apart at all. Outside, the rain had softened to a faint whisper against the pavement, the storm passing without announcement, leaving behind a quiet that felt earned. Inside, the room no longer carried the weight it had held before, no longer felt like a place of endings, but something else entirely, something that had been rewritten without force, without demand, by nothing more than a word remembered and a bond that refused to fade. And in that quiet space, where silence had once meant absence, it now meant something different, something full, something alive, something that did not need to be explained because it could be felt in every breath, every touch, every moment that followed. The room did not return to what it had been before, because some moments do not allow that. They change the air in ways that cannot be undone, and as Ethan remained there with his hand resting against Rex, the world outside that small space seemed to continue as it always had, but inside, something had shifted into place with quiet certainty. The veterinarian moved slowly now, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, as if stepping into a space that no longer belonged to routine, but to something far more personal. She reached for the clipboard, her fingers brushing over the paper where words had once carried finality, and for a brief moment, she simply looked at it, as though seeing it for the first time. The label did not fit anymore. It did not belong to the dog standing calmly beside the man who knew him, who spoke to him in a language that no form or report could capture. She exhaled softly, then set the clipboard down without another glance, the decision forming not as a dramatic choice, but as something obvious, something already decided by what she had witnessed. Ethan did not notice the movement, or perhaps he did, but it no longer mattered. His attention remained anchored where it had returned, in the steady presence at his side, in the warmth beneath his hand, in the quiet rhythm of a life that had found its way back to him. Rex shifted again, closer now, aligning himself naturally against Ethan's leg, his body settling into a position that felt both familiar and new, as if reclaiming something that had always been his place. The subtle pressure of that contact spoke louder than any sound, grounding Ethan in a way that no memory alone ever could. He adjusted his posture slightly, his free hand resting lightly against Rex's shoulder, fingers tracing the line of muscle and bone that had once moved with him through places far more uncertain than this quiet room. "You remember," Ethan said, his voice low, not asking, not doubting, simply acknowledging what had already been proven. Rex's ears flicked once at the sound, and his tail gave another slow, steady movement, the kind that carried understanding rather than excitement, the kind that said yes without breaking the calm that surrounded them. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving behind the soft drip of water from the edge of the roof, each drop landing with a quiet consistency that matched the steady rhythm of the moment inside. A distant car passed by, its tires moving through wet pavement, the sound fading quickly into the distance, unnoticed by both man and dog who now stood in a space where the outside world held little weight. The veterinarian stepped closer, her presence gentle, her voice softer than before when she finally spoke. "He does not have to stay here," she said, not as an announcement, but as a recognition of what had already become clear. Ethan turned his head slightly toward her, his expression calm, composed, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that had not been there when he first walked in. "He was never meant to," he replied quietly, his hand still resting against Rex, as if confirming that truth with every touch. There was no urgency in his voice, no need to argue or explain, because the answer had already been given long before the words were spoken. Rex remained steady, his posture relaxed now, but still attentive, still aligned with Ethan in that precise, instinctive way that had once defined their partnership and now returned without effort. The space between them no longer existed. It had been replaced by something stronger, something that had endured separation, confusion, and silence without breaking. The veterinarian nodded slowly, her gaze moving between them with a quiet understanding that did not require further questions. She stepped back once more, giving them space, not because she had been asked to, but because she knew it belonged to them. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the air filling his lungs with something that felt different now, something steadier, something certain. He shifted his weight carefully, preparing to stand, and as he did, Rex moved with him instantly, rising in perfect sync, adjusting his position without instruction, without hesitation, as if the connection between them had never been interrupted at all. Ethan paused for a brief moment, his hand resting again at the top of Rex's head, fingers pressing gently into the fur as if grounding himself in that contact one more time. "Let us go," he said softly, not as a command, not as an order, but as a simple truth, a direction spoken between two beings who no longer needed anything more than that. And Rex, without breaking stride, without needing to be told twice, stepped forward at his side, matching his pace, guiding without leading, present without question, as they moved together toward a door that no longer felt like an ending, but the quiet beginning of something returned. The door did not open with urgency. It opened slowly, almost gently, as if even it understood that what was passing through it was not something to be rushed, and as Ethan stepped forward, Rex moved in perfect alignment beside him, close enough that their sides nearly touched, not guiding with force, but with presence, the kind that required no correction, no leash, no command beyond what already lived between them. The hallway beyond carried a different kind of silence, one shaped by ordinary things, distant voices, the faint hum of air vents, the soft shuffle of footsteps. Somewhere far away, but to Ethan, those sounds felt distant now, softened by the steady rhythm at his side, by the quiet assurance that he was no longer moving through space alone. Rex adjusted his pace instinctively, matching each step with precision, his body angled just enough to remain within reach, his head slightly lowered as if listening not just to the world around them, but to Ethan himself, to the subtle shifts in movement, in breath, in balance that only he seemed to understand. Ethan's hand hovered just above Rex's shoulder at first, not gripping, not holding, but resting in that space where trust lives, where contact is optional because connection is certain. The cane remained in his other hand, but its presence had changed, no longer his only point of reference, no longer the sole guide through uncertainty. Now it was secondary, a tool rather than a lifeline. The veterinarian watched them go from the doorway, her expression quiet, her hands still, as if she understood that calling out, interrupting. Even offering words would diminish something that did not need explanation. The clipboard remained behind her on the counter, untouched, the ink that once defined a future now irrelevant, replaced by something no form could capture. Outside, the air carried the scent of rain fading into something cleaner, something lighter, the pavement still damp beneath the overcast sky, reflecting soft gray light that spread evenly across the parking lot. Ethan stepped out into that space with measured care, pausing just for a moment as if adjusting to the shift in air, in sound, in the subtle openness that replaced the enclosed quiet of the room they had left behind. Rex paused with him, not pulling forward, not urging movement, simply waiting, holding position in that familiar way, as if the world itself would not move until Ethan was ready. A breeze passed gently, brushing against them, carrying with it the distant sound of leaves shifting, of water dripping from edges and corners where the storm had not yet fully let go. Ethan inhaled slowly, the air filling his lungs with something that felt new and known at the same time, something that settled deeper than breath, something that reached into places that had long been untouched. It stopped raining, he said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation shaped by the absence of sound, by the way the world felt rather than how it looked. Rex's ears flicked at the words, his head turning slightly, as if acknowledging them, as if sharing in the awareness of something that had changed beyond the walls they had just left. Ethan lowered his hand then, resting it gently against Rex's neck, fingers pressing lightly into the fur, grounding himself once more in that contact, confirming what he no longer doubted. He took another step forward, and Rex moved with him instantly, not ahead, not behind, but exactly where he needed to be, adjusting without thought, without hesitation, the way he had always done. The parking lot stretched out in quiet simplicity, a few cars scattered across its surface, their shapes irrelevant to Ethan, but noted by Rex with a calm awareness that required no tension. They moved past them without pause, without deviation, the path unfolding naturally beneath their steps. There was no command spoken, no instruction given, and yet everything aligned. Everything flowed with a precision that did not need to be forced. A woman exiting the building slowed as she passed, her gaze drawn to the pair, to the way they moved together with such quiet certainty, and though she said nothing, there was something in her expression that softened, that lingered for a moment longer than usual before she continued on her way. Ethan did not notice her, or perhaps he did in the way one notices presence without needing to see it, but his focus remained where it had returned, in the steady, living connection at his side. They reached the edge of the lot where the sidewalk began, the concrete cool beneath their feet, the world opening further with each step, not in size, but in possibility, in the quiet understanding that what had been lost had not been gone, only waiting, only hidden beneath time and distance and silence. Ethan paused once more, his hand tightening slightly at Rex's neck, not out of doubt, but out of something deeper, something that held gratitude without needing to name it. Rex remained steady beside him, his presence unwavering, his attention fixed not on where they were going, but on who he was with, as it had always been. And in that quiet moment, under a sky still heavy with clouds but no longer carrying rain, they stood not as two separate lives crossing paths again, but as something restored, something whole, something that had found its way back without needing to be led. Some endings do not arrive with final words. They arrive with a quiet that feels complete, and as Ethan stood there at the edge of the sidewalk with Rex beside him, the world did not ask for anything more from them. It simply continued, steady and open, as if making room for what had just been restored. The clouds above shifted slowly, thinning just enough to let a pale light pass through, soft and diffused, touching the ground without urgency, without demand, the kind of light that does not blind but reveals gently, patiently. Ethan lifted his head slightly, not toward the sky, but toward that subtle change, feeling it rather than seeing it, the way he had learned to feel everything that mattered. Rex remained close, his body aligned in quiet readiness, his presence constant, unwavering, as if he had never known another place to be. The distance between past and present no longer stretched wide. It had folded into something smaller, something manageable, something that no longer carried the weight it once did. Ethan's hand moved again, resting briefly against Rex's head, fingers pressing into the familiar warmth, not to confirm, not to question, but simply because he could, because the choice was there again, and that alone was enough. "We are all right," he said softly, the words more for himself than for anything else, but Rex responded anyway, his tail moving once in that slow, steady rhythm. The same rhythm that had carried them through uncertainty before, the same rhythm that now marked something steadier, something grounded. A car passed somewhere behind them, its sound fading quickly, and a door closed in the distance, small, ordinary sounds that no longer held significance, because what mattered stood here, in this quiet space where nothing needed to be proven, nothing needed to be explained. Ethan took a step forward, then another, his movement confident now, not because the world had changed, but because he no longer faced it alone, because something that had once guided him through darkness had returned, not as a memory, but as a living presence at his side. Rex matched him with ease, his pace steady, his attention focused, not scanning for threats, not searching for direction, but simply staying, exactly as he had been asked, exactly as he had always done. They moved down the sidewalk together, their steps falling into a shared rhythm that did not need to be learned again, that had simply been waiting to resume. The air carried the last traces of rain, fading into something cleaner, something lighter, and with each step, the world felt less like something to navigate and more like something to walk through, side by side, without fear, without hesitation. Ethan did not speak again, and he did not need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, filled with understanding, with trust, with something that had endured beyond absence and returned without condition. And as they continued forward, disappearing slowly into the quiet stretch of the street, there was no announcement, no grand moment to mark what had happened. Only the simple truth that sometimes, what is meant to stay does not need to be found again. It only needs to be remembered, and when it is, it comes back not with noise, not with force, but with a quiet grace that changes everything without asking for anything in return.